A father must protect, love, and nurture. But what happens when a father becomes a child's worst nightmare? This is the tragic case of Bryan Stewart, the man who intentionally infected his own infant son with HIV to escape responsibility. The early 1990s, a time of scientific progress and medical breakthroughs, but also of fear. The world was still reeling from the HIV/AIDS crisis. Misinformation was rampant. The diagnosis was often seen as a death sentence, and those infected were stigmatized, feared, and in some cases abandoned. In Missouri, like much of America, the legal system was still adapting to the realities of this epidemic. Child support enforcement was growing stricter, and for many unwilling fathers, evasion was no longer an option. It was in this world that a crime so shocking, so unimaginable, would unfold. One that would leave an innocent child suffering and an entire nation horrified. Before we unravel this intriguing story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to True Crime Tales. Stay tuned for more gripping tales that expose the darkest depths of human nature and behavior. Bryan Stewart was a man with secrets, a man with a past, and one fateful decision, one act of pure evil, would change the course of his own son's life forever. Bryan Stewart was, by all appearances, an ordinary man. He worked in the medical field, a profession built on care and responsibility. As a hospital worker, he moved through sterile hallways and operated in a world where life and death often hung in balance. But outside of work, his life told a different story, one marked by avoidance, conflict, and a refusal to take responsibility for the things that mattered most. His relationships were fleeting, his commitments uncertain, and when he met the woman who would later give birth to his child, it was never with the intention of building a future together. Their time together was brief, a chapter he seemed eager to close, but life had other plans. In 1992, she gave birth to a son, Bryan Stewart Jr., affectionately known as BJ. For most parents, the arrival of a child is a defining moment, a bond that changes everything. But for Bryan Stewart, it was something else entirely. He did not celebrate the birth of his son. He did not embrace the new role of fatherhood. Instead, he distanced himself, refusing to acknowledge BJ as his own. His rejection was not just emotional, it was deliberate. He avoided contact, dismissed any responsibility, and when faced with the legal reality of child support, his resentment grew. He saw his son not as family, but as an obstacle, an obligation he wanted nothing to do with. And it was this resentment that would lead him down a path no one could have imagined. For months, Bryan Stewart ignored the life he had created. He had no interest in the milestones of his child, no desire to play a role in his upbringing. But as legal pressure mounted, and the court ordered him to pay child support, Stewart's resentment turned into something far more dangerous. It was no longer just avoidance, it was hostility. And with that hostility came a plan, one so unfathomable that no one could have predicted what was to come. At the time, Stewart worked in a hospital. He had access to medical supplies, to syringes, to things the general public could never obtain. And somewhere along the way, an opportunity presented itself, one that would forever change the course of his son's life. The exact details remain unknown. What we do know is that Stewart acquired a syringe filled with HIV-positive blood. He had the knowledge, the means, and the intent. And then one day, he acted. We can only speculate on how it happened. A quiet moment alone with the child, a needle hidden from view, a quick motion, precise, deliberate. The prick of a syringe so small, so subtle, that a child so young would not even have known what had been done to him. And just like that, Bryan Stewart had set something in motion that could never be undone. There were no immediate signs, no alarms raised. The child, too young to speak, too small to understand, carried on as if nothing had happened. But inside his tiny body, a silent battle had begun. In the weeks that followed, the first signs of trouble appeared. What had once been the normal fussing of an infant became something more. A lingering fever, an unexplained fatigue, symptoms that didn't quite add up. His mother, like any concerned parent, did what she could. She took him to the doctor, seeking answers. At first, there was no immediate concern. Children get sick, fevers come and go, but as time passed, the symptoms worsened. BJ was losing weight, He wasn't growing as he should. There were infections, strange ones that didn't quite respond to treatment, and yet no one could explain why. She took him back, again and again, hoping for a diagnosis, a treatment, a solution. But every test came back inconclusive. The doctors were baffled. And all the while, BJ's condition continued to decline. Then finally an answer. A test result that no one expected. BJ was diagnosed with HIV. For a mother, it was unthinkable. Her child, barely past infancy, had somehow contracted a virus that should have been impossible. The weight of that moment, of hearing those words, was indescribable. She had never tested positive. There was no medical reason for this. There was no explanation, unless someone had done this to him. The moment of realization must have been overwhelming. She thought back, retraced every visit, every interaction. And then the pieces began to fall into place. The father who wanted nothing to do with his son, the man who had access to hospital supplies, the one person with both the means and the motive. Bryan Stewart. At first it seemed impossible. Who could believe that a father would do such a thing to his own child? But as investigators began looking deeper, the evidence became harder to ignore. Medical experts were brought in. The strain of HIV in BJ's body was examined, analyzed, and compared. The results were damning. This was no ordinary transmission. This was deliberate. Then came the final piece of the puzzle. Stewart's hospital access. He had worked around infected blood. He had the ability to take samples without raising suspicion. And when the timeline was reconstructed, it became clear. Everything led back to him. It was no longer a question of possibility. It was a fact. Bryan Stewart had done the unthinkable, and now justice had to follow. The medical reports were conclusive. The strain of HIV in baby BJ's system was not accidental. It was intentional. The evidence pointed to one person, his father. Now it was up to law enforcement to prove it. Detectives began their work. Bryan Stewart, a hospital worker with direct access to medical supplies, was the only logical suspect. But proving such a crime required more than just suspicion. It required undeniable proof. Investigators began by looking at the science. How could an infant, born to a mother who tested negative, contract HIV? Doctors and forensic specialists weighed in. There were only a few possible explanations. Accidental transmission in a medical setting was ruled out. There had been no hospital errors, no mix-ups. The child had not received any blood transfusions, nor had he been exposed to any external risks. That left just one terrifying possibility: intentional injection. Forensic experts examined Stewart's workplace, his access to blood samples, the ease with which he could obtain a contaminated syringe without raising suspicion. It all fit together. Then came the expert testimonies. Doctors and virologists explaining how HIV spreads, how the strain in BJ's body matched known infected samples, and why there was no reasonable explanation except foul play. With every discovery, the case against Bryan Stewart grew stronger. But there was still one unanswered question. What would he say when confronted? When investigators finally sat down with Bryan Stewart, they were met with something chilling. Not panic, not remorse, but indifference. He denied everything. He showed no concern, no outrage, no sadness. His child was dying, and yet he remained unmoved. His statements were calculated, never offering more than necessary, never showing signs of distress. But the evidence was piling up. Prosecutors were preparing for trial, determined to prove one thing, that Stewart had knowingly, deliberately infected his own son. The legal challenge was unique. This was not a conventional murder case. It was slow, silent, and medical. The crime itself had taken years to unfold. The prosecution had to establish intent to prove beyond a doubt that Stewart's actions were deliberate. And with expert testimony, forensic science, and Stewart's own callous behavior, they built their case piece by piece. As the trial date approached, the media caught wind of the story. And when the details became public, the outrage was immediate. The courtroom was packed. Journalists, legal analysts, and ordinary citizens filled the seats, all struggling to comprehend the crime at the center of the case. A father accused of infecting his own child with HIV. It was a crime so rare, so calculated, that even seasoned prosecutors struggled to compare it to anything they had seen before. The prosecution opened with the science. Medical professionals took the stand, explaining the forensic evidence. They detailed how the strain of HIV in BJ's body was not naturally occurring in his environment. They explained the method of transmission, how it was introduced into his system, and why it could not have been accidental. Then came the investigators. They laid out Stewart's access to medical supplies, his resentment toward paying child support, and his cold, emotionless response when questioned. They presented the timeline, showing how Stewart was present at key moments before BJ's symptoms began. It was a damning case. The mother's testimony was among the most emotional. She described the moment she learned of her son's diagnosis, the years of watching him struggle, the helplessness of knowing that something had been done to him but not knowing why. Her pain was visible. The jury listened in silence, some shaking their heads in disbelief. And then there was the jury's reaction. They had heard murder cases before. They had seen tragic crimes. But this was something else. The expressions on their faces ranged from horror to shock to quiet anger. They watched Stewart closely. They waited for a sign of regret, an apology, even the slightest emotion. But none came. The effects of HIV are not immediate. It is a slow, silent attack on the body, breaking down the immune system piece by piece. For an adult, the progression can take years. For a child, especially one as young as BJ, the timeline is far more cruel. At first, his symptoms came and went. Low-grade fevers, a constant nagging fatigue, infections that took longer to heal. But as time passed, the signs became impossible to ignore. His body struggled to fight off even the most minor illnesses. A simple cold would linger for weeks, turning into something more serious. He suffered from chronic respiratory infections, his lungs weakened by pneumonia. His skin developed sores that would not heal. His small frame, already fragile, began to thin even more. Doctors did what they could. Treatments were administered, but in the 1990s, the medical options for a child with AIDS were limited. There was no cure, only efforts to slow the inevitable. And as much as his mother fought to save him, as much as she searched for answers and pleaded for hope, the truth was undeniable. Her son was dying. By the time BJ reached the age of 7, his condition had worsened beyond recovery. The virus had done its damage. His immune system was gone, leaving him vulnerable to infections his body could no longer fight. He became weaker, unable to move as freely as before. His once bright energy faded into exhaustion. Even speaking became a struggle. In his last days, he remained surrounded by those who loved him. His mother by his side, holding him close, refusing to leave. She whispered to him, told him stories, and comforted him in ways only a mother can. She hoped, perhaps, that in some small way he would feel safe, that he would not be afraid. And then, after 7 years of pain, 7 years of suffering caused by the man who should have protected him, Bryan Stewart Jr., BJ, took his last breath. Grief is not just sadness, it is an emptiness, an ache that never truly fades. For BJ's mother, it was the unbearable loss of a child who had suffered needlessly, a child who should have had a future, a childhood filled with laughter, love, and possibility. But instead, she had been forced to watch him fade away, knowing that his pain had been inflicted deliberately, that his suffering was not fate, not chance, but the result of a choice made by his own father. Her grief was not just for the life that was lost, but for the life that could have been. The birthdays that would never be celebrated, the school days that would never come, the moments, the milestones, the memories that would remain forever unfulfilled. She mourned not just as a mother, but as a witness to an unimaginable crime. And though she had fought for answers, for justice, for the truth to be known, it would never undo the pain. It would never bring her child back. BJ's story was not just a tragedy. It was a reminder of the depths of cruelty, the consequences of a single act of malice. And for those who heard it, for those who knew what had been done to him, one question would always remain: how could a father do this to his own son? For weeks, the courtroom had heard the details of a crime so shocking, so deliberate, that even seasoned legal experts struggled to find precedent. Prosecutors had laid out the evidence, the medical records, the forensic findings, the timeline of events, Experts had explained, in painstaking detail, how HIV does not appear in a healthy infant without external intervention. And the jury had listened, watching Bryan Stewart's every move, searching for any sign of remorse, any trace of emotion. They found none. As the final arguments were made, as the defense struggled to cast doubt on what seemed undeniable, one fact remained: baby BJ had suffered. And that suffering had been inflicted by the one person who should have protected him the most. Then at last, the moment arrived. The jury had reached a decision. As the courtroom fell silent, the judge asked the foreman to deliver the verdict. The words were clear, final, and absolute. Bryan Stewart was found guilty of first-degree murder. For a crime so methodical, so merciless, there could be no leniency. The court ruled that Stewart's actions were not impulsive or reckless, but calculated. His intent had been clear from the beginning, and now he would face the consequences. The sentence: life in prison. There would be no chance of parole, no opportunity to walk free. The man who had condemned his own child to death would now spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for those who had loved BJ, for those who had fought for justice, there was no real victory. No sentence could undo the pain, no punishment could bring back the child who had been taken. His mother, his family, those who had watched him suffer, they were left with an absence that no courtroom decision could ever fill. Bryan Stewart was locked away. But the memory of what he had done, the horror of his crime, would never be forgotten. Justice was served, but no verdict, no sentence, could ever erase the suffering inflicted upon an innocent child. Baby BJ's life was taken not by accident or disease, but by deliberate cruelty. He never had the chance to grow up, to experience joy, to dream of a future. And all of it, his laughter, his potential, his very existence, was stolen by the one person who should have protected him the most. This case is a reminder of the depths of human cruelty, but also of the power of truth. It took years, relentless effort, and a mother's unwavering fight to bring the truth to light. And while BJ did not live to see justice served, his story remains, etched in history, as a testament to the consequences of unchecked evil and the enduring strength of those who refused to let it go unanswered. The world must never forget what happened to Bryan Stewart Jr. His story is not just one of tragedy, but of awareness, of vigilance, and of the importance of holding those who harm the innocent accountable. If this story moved you, if you believe in shining a light on injustice, consider subscribing to this channel. We bring you the stories that must be told, the ones that reveal not just the darkness of the world, but the fight for truth that follows. Your support helps us continue to share these important narratives, to give a voice to those who can no longer speak for themselves. So, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join us as we uncover the cases that demand to be remembered. Because some stories should never be forgotten.